Greeting to all YouTube and Facebook viewers. I am Vansworth Mackenzie. I have decided to bring out this video about Mr. Rastafari Makonnen, who was from the land, Genesis chapter 10 and verse 7, called as the land of Seba, that became known as the land of Ethiopia by the Greek people of Europe. Seba was the first son of Cush, according to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 7. So Rastafari Makonnen, who became known as Hail Selassie, who the Rastafarian believers teach that Hail Selassie is a conquering line of the tribe of Judah that was translated by the Romans as Judah, which is nothing but falsehood and lies, because the conquering line of the tribe of Judah that became known as Judah that they spoke of is our Lord Yeshua, who will conquer all the nation of the earth at his second coming as King of all kings and Lord of all lords as far as man is concerned. As I've mentioned before in one of my videos, that the tribe of Judah came from a Canaanite woman who was known as Sulah, according to Genesis chapter 38 and verse 2 to verse 6. Judah also had twins by his daughter-in-law, who was known as Tamar, who also was a Canaanite woman, according to Genesis chapter 38 and verse 27 to verse 30, who pretended to be a prostitute woman to deceive her father-in-law. So by these sons of Judah gave birth to the tribe that the Roman named as the tribe of Judah in the Latin language of the Romans, and Jews in the various Germanic dialect of Europe. As I've mentioned, that according to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 7, Seba was the first son of Cush, and his land is what is now known as Ethiopia. That was named after Cush's first son, who was known as Seba. My reason for putting so much effort to bring out these videos, it is because as I've heard so much false statement made on YouTube that Rastafari Makonnen, who became known as Hail Selassie, is a direct descendant from the queen who came from the land of Sheba and King Solomon of Jerusalem. I would like to let this fact to be known, that the land of Sheba that is mentioned in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 7 is not speaking of the land of Seba, who was the first son of Cush. But the land that the scripture spoke of as the land of Sheba is where the queen of Sheba came from, who went to Jerusalem to bring presents of gold and other treasures to King Solomon from her land of Sheba, that is known today as Yemen, by the conquest of the Mohammedan Muslim people of what became known today as the land of Saudi Arabia, who changed the name of the land of Sheba to the name of Yemen, as it is known today as. According to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 7, Sheba, where the land got its name from, was one of the grandsons of Cush, and his father was known as Ramah, who was the fourth son of Cush. This knowledge I came to is by looking at the scripture map of 1890, showing the land of Ramah that was right in the land era that became known today as Saudi Arabia, of the Ishmaelite people of Hagar and Abraham, whose mother gave him a land era that was known as Tamar, who was the ninth son of Ishmael to settle on. And Hagar came from the land of Mizraim that became known as Egypt by the people of Greece. So the land that became known as Ethiopia as the land of Seba is totally false and not of truth. Sad to say that many Amite people of today can easily be deceived because they do not have any knowledge and understanding of this true history that is taught in the scripture of truth. Again, I want to point out that the people of Am who listen and believe in the teaching of these historians, scientists, and the archaeologists, that they are not Yahweh, who knoweth all things, and who have given the scripture of true history, of truth, to be a light of knowledge of the human family that came down from Noah and his 3 sons, who had populated the earth after the flood of Noah. I also want to point out that the statement the Rastafarian and the encyclopedia teach that Rastafri Makonnen is a direct descendant of King Solomon and the queen that came from the land of Seba, that they teach to be the land that became known as the land of Ethiopia, is totally false and far away from the truth. To prove my point that it is so, there is nowhere in verse 1 of the scripture where it explains that the queen of Sheba, who went to see King Solomon at Jerusalem, had a romantic affair with King Solomon, and by this romantic affair they had a son who was named this or that. So the story that the Rastafarian believers and the Encyclopedia Britannica teach that Hail Selassie is a direct descendant from Emperor Menelik I, who was the son of King Solomon and the queen that came from the land of Seba, is not of truth. My reason for saying this: when I checked the scripture of truth, I could not come across any kind of recorded information about this person who was known as Menelik I, who the encyclopedia and the Rastafarian believers claim was a son of King Solomon and the queen that came from the land of Sheba. So this teaching of the Rastafarian believers and the teaching of the encyclopedia is a vain and false belief and a teaching to the mind of many Amite people to deceive them to believe a lie. If this statement was of truth, the scripture would have mentioned it, just like how the scripture mentioned at 1 Kings chapter 7 and verse 8, that King Solomon's first wife was a daughter of Pharaoh, who was ruling as king over the land of Mizraim, that became known as Egypt, during the reign of King Solomon, ruling as king over the kingdom of Israel. Also, just as all the scripture mentioned at 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2 to verse 6, also chapter 12, reading from verse 1 to verse 14, where the scripture mentioned that King David, who was the father of King Solomon, took the wife of Uriah, who was from the tribe of the Hittite people of Canaan, and have sex with her, because she was a beautiful woman to look at. And she conceived and bare King David a child. Due to this wicked act of King David did to Uriah in taking away his wife and had him killed in a battle of war, Yahweh was not pleased with him, and because of his deed, the child died, according to what Nathan the prophet had told David of his secret deed. However, after the child died, she conceived again and bare a son by the name of Solomon. And Yahweh spared Solomon's life because he found favor in him, and Yahweh let him become king after the death of his father David. Yahweh is the author of the writing of the scripture, who did not have the writers of the scripture to hide this story from the world of people who would later read the scripture for themselves to see all these things that were done by King David. Yahweh left it there to be known to the rest of the people of the world who would eventually read the scripture to see and to know about these things for themselves. I must point out that Yahweh is not the author of hypocrisy and deceit, but he is of truth, and there is no deceit in him. This is the reason why he had these things to be written in the scripture of truth, so everyone would know of it. This is the reason why he did send Nathan the prophet to tell David of his secret deed. So Bathsheba, who was from the family of the Hittite people of Canaan, was the mother of King Solomon. According to 1 Kings chapter 11, starting from verse 1, after Pharaoh's daughter, who was the first wife for King Solomon, he had many wives and concubines and princesses from among the various granddaughters of the people of Am, who were their neighbors. They were living around in the land of Canaan and what became known as North Africa, that became known as North Africa, that they also came out of. Chapter 10 of 1 King explained that when the queen who came from the land of Sheba to see King Solomon at Jerusalem, she talked with him of all that was in her heart, and Solomon answered all her questions concerning his God. The scripture explained that she said to King Solomon that it was a true report she heard of him in her country, of his wisdom, but she did not believe until she saw all these things for herself of his wisdom. There is nothing in 1 Kings chapter 10 to lead anyone to believe that there were a sexual romantic affair that took place between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, and by virtue of this romantic affair they had a son whose name was this or that. If it was so, the scripture would have mentioned it, just like how the scripture mentioned other things that the children of Israel did. So this statement that came from the Rastafarian believers and the Encyclopedia Britannica about King Solomon and the queen who came from the land of Sheba, who had a son for King Solomon by the name of Menelik I, is a total lie. As I've mentioned in many of my videos on YouTube, that Cush's second grandson land era was known as Dedan, according to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 7. But the land of Dedan was conquered by the Mohammedan Muslim people of Ishmael and became known as the United Arab Emirates. And the land of Dedan was named later to the land of Dubai, as it is known as today. As I had mentioned before in my first video on YouTube, that the land of Cush became known today as the land of Sudan by the conquest of the Mohammedan Muslim people of what became known as Saudi Arabia. The people of Cush was known as Seba, that became known as Ethiopia today. Genesis chapter 10 and verse 7 mention that the second son of Cush was known as Avalah, and the land of Avalah became known as Nubia of today by the conquest of the Ishmaelite Mohammedan Muslim people, who became known as the Saudi Arabian people. I came to this knowledge about the land of Avalah by reading Genesis chapter 2 and verse 10 and 11, where the scriptures speak of the river that came from out of the Garden of Eden that did compass the land of Avalah and also the land of Seba that became known as Ethiopia. So what the scripture is telling us is that the Garden of Eden was somewhere in what became known as East Africa of today. The last son of Cush was known as Nimrod, who had 4 kingdoms in the land of Canaan that is known in the scripture as the land of Shinar, that became known as the Persian Gulf of today by the various conquerors. Verse 10 of Genesis chapter 10 explained that one of the kingdom of Nimrod was Nineveh, which was the land of Assyria. He also had the kingdom of Iran that became known as Iraq by the conquest of the Mohammedan Muslim people of Saudi Arabia. Also the land of Babel, where the name Babylon came from, that became known as Kuwait of today. It was Nimrod and his companion who was building the Tower of Babel to reach up to heaven. But Yahweh confused the language of the people who were building the Tower of Babel to reach up to heaven, to stop them from building the tower, because they could not understand each other's speeches. And he also scattered them throughout the earth. So the name became known as Babylon, after the name of the Tower of Babel. I have mentioned some of these things in my first video on YouTube, but my reason for mentioning these things again, it is because since I have brought out my history book that is called The Untold, Forgotten, Great Civilization of the People of Am, and my many videos on YouTube, I have taken notice of various people explaining about the land era of the various sons of Noah who had populated the earth after the flood. I was watching on YouTube a European historian lady showing and explaining of the land era of the three sons of Noah and their descendants according to what she perceived to be so and what she was taught to believe. In her expression, she pointed out that the land of Canaan, that is now known as Israel and what became known as the land of Saudi Arabia, is the land era of Shem and his descendants who had settled there after the flood of Noah. Also after Yahweh confused the language of the people who were building the Tower of Babel to reach up to heaven, when he scattered them throughout the earth. First, I must say, this historian lady is not accurate in what she was saying, because Genesis chapter 10 and verse 22 explained that the first son of Shem was known as Elam, and the land of Elam is in the era where Shem and his descendants had settled after the flood and after the confusion of the language of the people who were building the Tower of Babel to reach up to heaven. Looking at the scripture map of 1890, showing the land of Elam where Shem and his descendants had settled, that was known as Elam. And the land of Elam became known as Persia. And the land of Persia became known as Iran after the conquest of Alexander the Great and his general of Macedonia, with other Greek people, because all Greek countries did come under the empire of Philip II of Macedonia, who was the father of Alexander the Great. So the land of Persia is in the part of the world that the Gentile people of Europe name as Asia, because they have conquered the world of people and their lands that did become their empire and colonies. So the people of Asia are the many descendants of the people of Shem. So this historian European lady is wrong in her teaching and showing the land of Canaan that is now known today as Israel and Saudi Arabia to be the land era of Shem and his many descendants. So I would like to let this fact to be known, that the first civilization of the world after the flood of Noah was started with the people of Am, that was started from what became known as East Africa, where the Garden of Eden was located. Also, the people of Am land era was from Canaan, Babylon, Iran, that became known as Iraq by the conquest of the Mohammedan Muslim people of what became known as Saudi Arabia, all the way to the land of Assyria, of the city of Nineveh, of the various kingdom of Nimrod, who was the last son of Cush, according to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 8. Although many of these ancient kingdoms of the people were destroyed and conquered by other people that Yahweh did use to bring about the downfall of these kingdoms, according to the various prophecies that were spoken against these kingdoms that Yahweh was not pleased with. To give one an idea of the truthfulness of the prophecy of the scripture, that not many people realize how much the prophecies of the scripture as in our daily lives of today. At Isaiah chapter 45, starting from verse 1, there Yahweh said that he has anointed Cyrus of Persia to subdue nation before him. So because of this very prophecy, Cyrus was able to establish the Persian Empire that did rule Babylon, Mizraim, the land of Seba, that became known as Ethiopia, all the way to Greece of the Turkic era of Europe, that did become a part of the Persian Empire of Cyrus and the other Persian kings that followed after him, in which the kingdom of Mizraim, Babylon, Assyria, and the various kingdom of the Canaanite people was first established before Persia became a world power, and before Persia was destroyed by Alexander the Great with the people of Greece, as it was so prophesied in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 of the coming up of these powers of Babylon to Persia and Greece, and last of all, the fourth beast of the iron leg that stood for the power of Rome. From what I have read from the encyclopedia and the dictionary of the Bible, that the cuneiform Akkadian writing script of the people of Assyria and Babylon, as well as the Canaanite writing of Aramaic, did become a part of the writing script of the Persian Empire. So many people of today do not have any idea of how much the prophecies of the scripture have an effect on our life of today. I also want to mention that many times I have heard the statement made on YouTube that the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh that he gave to the children of Israel, that as his laws and covenant, that became known as the scroll, the scripture, and what became known as the Bible, is in the land of Seba, that became known as Ethiopia, that was brought there by Menelik I, who was this son of Solomon and the queen that came from the land of Sheba. First, I must say that this statement that is made on YouTube is a false statement that have no truth in it. I was watching a documentary on YouTube of this historian by the name of Mr. Casely Ayford explaining about the Ark of the Covenant that he was told is in the land of Seba, now known as Ethiopia, which is not of truth. My reason for saying this: Yahweh gave Moses a strict commandment that is mentioned in Numbers chapter 3 and verse 6 to verse 13. There Yahweh said to Moses that he has taken the tribe of Levi, who was one of the sons of Jacob, that became known as the tribe of the Levites, to have the service of the tabernacle of the children of Israel, that did eventually become known as the temple that King Solomon did build for the service of the worship of Yahweh at Jerusalem. There the tribe of the Levite was to do all the service of the tabernacle or the temple of the congregation service from where Moses and Aaron came from. So if the Shebian people of Cush, who became known as the Ethiopian people of today, if they was to touch or carry the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, or anything pertaining to do with the service of the temple of the congregation of the children of Israel, they would surely lose their life by the power of Yahweh, because this service was only given to the Levite tribe of the children of Israel. To give one a good example of how strict the word of Yahweh is and his commandment, there at 1 Samuel chapter 5, starting from verse 1, Yahweh allowed the Philistine army of the people of Mizraim to capture the Ark of the Covenant from the children of Israel because of the sin of Eli's two sons, who was the priest at the time of young Samuel. These sons of Eli was known as Ophni and Phinehas, according to chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, starting from verse 22 to verse 24. There the scripture explains that these two sons of Eli lie or have sex with the woman at the assembled door of the tabernacle of the congregation of the children of Israel. So because of the sin of these two sons of Eli, the priests, Yahweh allowed the Philistine army to capture the covenant of the ark of Yahweh, and that these two sons of Eli would be killed by the Philistine army. The killing of these two sons of Eli was to destroy the house of Eli name forever because of the sin of his two sons, meaning that these two sons of Eli would not be able to produce any offspring to carry on the name of Eli forever. The way Yahweh saw it, Eli put his two sons before him in not taking action against them for their deeds. So the ark of Yahweh was captured by the Philistine, and the two sons of Eli was also killed by the army of the Philistine, and the ark of the covenant was taken by the Philistine army. And they brought it to Ebenezer and Ashdod of the house of their God, whose name was known as Dagon. Chapter 5 of 1 Samuel and verse 5 went on to explain that the hands of Yahweh were upon Dagon and upon the Philistine people because of the ark of the covenant of Yahweh that was in their midst of the Philistine people, that he had only given to the children of Israel. Verse 7 of chapter 5 went on to explain that when the Philistine men of Ashdod saw that the hands of Yahweh were upon Dagon and upon the Philistine people at large, they mentioned that the ark of Yahweh shall not abide amongst them. In the eyes of the Philistine people, they must send away the ark from among them before they all be consumed by the power of Yahweh. Verse 9 of chapter 5 of verse Samuel explained that after the Philistine people carried the ark about, for the hand of Yahweh was upon their cities and upon the people, both great and small, with a great destruction. Therefore they sent away the ark to the city of Ekron, and there the people of the city of Ekron cry out by saying, they have brought the ark of Yahweh to slay them. So the people sent and called for all the lords of the Philistine people for them to send away the ark from them. According to verse 7 to verse 13 of chapter 6 of 1 Samuel, the ark of Yahweh was put upon a cart that was pulled by two cows, that no yoke of burden did not put upon their necks to do any kind of work. After the ark was placed upon the cart that these two cows were pulling, the ark was taken back to the people of Israel at Beth-shemesh. Verse 15 of chapter 6 of 1 Samuel explained that it was the men of the Levite who took down the ark from the cart that was pulled by these two cows. According to verse 19 and 20 of 1 Samuel chapter 6, there it explained that Yahweh smote the Israelite people of Beth-shemesh because they went and looked into the ark, and it was only for the Levites to do so, and not for any of the ordinary people of Israel to do so. Verse 21 of chapter 6 of 1 Samuel went on to say that the Israelite people of Beth-shemesh sent messengers to the Israelite inhabitants of Kirjath-jearim that they must come and take away the ark from them, because it was returned from the Philistine. To further show the seriousness of the commandment and the word of Yahweh that is mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 6, starting from verse 1. There one will see that when David became king, he and the rest of the children of Israel went to the house of Abinadab to bring the ark of the covenant to Jerusalem. While David and the rest of the people was going along, the ark shook as if it was going to fall from the cart to the ground that was pulled by these two cows. According to verse 6 of 2 Samuel chapter 6, Uzziah put forth his hand to stabilize the ark from falling as he had taught, and he was struck down by the power of Yahweh to do so, for it was only the Levite was to angle or touch the ark or anything to do with the tabernacle. Verse 10 of 2 Samuel chapter 6 went on to explain that because of the death of Uzziah, David was afraid to bring the ark with him to Jerusalem. According to verse 11 of 2 Samuel chapter 6, because David was afraid to bring the ark with him to Jerusalem, he left it at the house of Obed-Edom. According to verse 12 of 2 Samuel chapter 6, it was told David how Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom for keeping the ark in his house. Verse 10 of 2 Samuel chapter 6 explained that David went to the house of Obed-Edom and had the ark to remove from his house to the city of Jerusalem. My reason for going so deep into the history of the story of the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, it is to show that it is not possible for the ark of the covenant of Yahweh to be in the land of Seba, now known as Ethiopia. Another reason for me making this statement, as I've explained, from the book of Numbers to the book of 2 Samuel, or to the book of Samuel, that the carrying of the ark was only for the Levite tribe to do so only. So if the Sabean people of Cush was to carry or touch the ark of the covenant of Yahweh he had only given to the children of Israel, they would surely lose their life. Just like the Philistine people of Mizraim, who had touched and carried the ark and was slain by the power of Yahweh for doing so. So this story about Menelik I, who the Rastafarian and the encyclopedia claim was a legendary son of King Solomon and the queen who came from the land of Seba, who they say was responsible for bringing the ark to Ethiopia, it is a false fairy tale story without any truth in it. So this Christian Orthodox Church of Ethiopia, where they claim the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh is kept, which is a branch of the Roman Catholic Church that took on the title of the Orthodox Church, that did sprung out of paganism, idolatry worship, like that of the rest of the churches of today, that did come from out of the Catholic Church and from out of Protestantism of Europe. So many are my people who go to YouTube to take in knowledge from these historians, scientists, and the archaeologists need to be careful of what they take into their minds as facts, according to what they were taught to believe. Because what a person takes into their mind, it is not very easy to erase these false teaching that is called brainwashing. Was it not these same scientists, historians, and the archaeologists who teach their many captive people about Mother Nature, who they say created this or that? Also, about 1 million or 10 million years ago, this was and that was, and none of these scientists, historians, and archaeologists was around in that time period to know what was and to know how this or that came about. But they came up with a deceptiveness to deceive their many captive people of today who go to their school system to be educated by them to get their degree to get a good paying job. Many of who watches their television program to take in knowledge. The same is true for these scientists, historians, and the archaeologists of the Gentile European people who have captured the world of people and their lands, who teach their many captive people who were educated in their school system that men evolved from monkeys and apes, that they also show in their dictionary as facts. even before the days of Columbus, the belief and thought of the family of Europe was that the earth was flat and not round. And they only came to the knowledge that the earth was round and not flat as they did thought during the time of their colonial conquest of people and their lands that became their colonies and empires. These are the same people who teach us about prehistoric people, an alien who they say was responsible for the building of the civilization of Mizraim and that of the Asian world. Thank you, YouTube, for giving me this opportunity of bringing out this video. It's very important. Like I said again, many, especially my people, do not have much knowledge about this history or things that I've written about because they were not taught. And if they were taught, they were brainwashed in the school system to believe all these fairy tales that come from the European people of their colonies, to see things their way. Also from the Mohammedans, because they're the same way. So again, thank you very much.